You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Muley Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Muley Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Everybody knows I'm a Muley fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Coursey.
Welcome to Wild Things and Wild Places. Today, joining me remotely, we're doing this podcast by distance, primarily because Dr. Michael Curran is in New Jersey, and there was just no way to really be able to connect face-to-face. Dr. Curran, thank you for your time today. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I look forward to it.
So let me just give the listeners a little backdrop on how this came to be, because this actually goes back to a previous podcast that you had actually listened to, and I was curious how you had heard about it, but a podcast that I had done with the vice president of Jonah Energy, Paul Ulrich, 4 or 5 weeks ago. How did you hear about that one?
I think I saw either Paul or Jonah Energy shared it on their LinkedIn page, so I was listening to it while I was driving one day. I was actually back out in Wyoming the last few weeks, and one of the drives I listened to it, and he had a lot of good stuff to say, and I figured I'd reach out and see if you needed any updates on some of the great reclamation work they're doing out there in Sublette County.
Perfect segue, because that's exactly where the conversation went from there between you and I. Paul and I were able to visit a lot about how oil and gas and the conservation communities really work together and are really not at the opposite end of the spectrum, as so many sometimes want to put. But you and I got to visit a little bit more in depth about what really that means when you talk about reclamation. It's talked about so much, but when you get down to the soil level, if you will, there's really a lot to it. And it truly is a science. It's not just good practices and let's improve. It's all of that, but it's so much more. And really, you're an expert in that. Let's talk a little bit about your education and your experience, because you truly are an expert in this field. And I know sometimes that's a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, because I think by nature, most of us are just humble. But let's hear it. Let's talk about how you are the expert in this field. Yeah,
I did my bachelor's degree at the University of Delaware, and there I just happenstance wound up being a lab technician in an entomologist's lab. That's how I fell into enjoying science. I was studying terrestrial food webs and how native plants versus non-native plants impact insects. We were specifically looking at caterpillars and lepidopteran, and then how we found 96% of terrestrial birds rear their young primarily on insects. And here in the mid-Atlantic, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania is where we were studying, and found if you use a Japanese maple in your backyard versus a native maple, the native maple will host over 137 species of caterpillar. And then over time, that lab was able to quantify that you could have a marked increase in songbirds in these kind of suburban and almost urban environments just by planting native vegetation. And while that guy was an entomologist who I worked for, he would really call himself like a restoration ecologist. So that's what led me into, I just thought it was fascinating, just understanding you can make a difference by choosing what you're planting in the ground. Impacts the insects that come, and then that impacts the birds, and then the bigger birds that eat the songbirds, and so on and so forth. I wound up moving out to Wyoming in 2010 to get my master's degree. I was funded by BP to look at reclamation best management practices. They were at the time operating in Wamsutter, the Moxa Arc in southwest Wyoming, and then in the Jonah field. I was really doing data management, and my master's was rangeland ecology and watershed management, but I was looking at how different seed mixes responded to different soil types and how different soil amendments worked or didn't work. And then you're probably, like everybody else in Wyoming, is familiar with the whole sage grouse saga going on out there. I got a call from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Wyoming Game and Fish. I think in 2013, I was supposed to finish my master's, and they called me over to Cheyenne and said, we don't really know how reclamation fits into this sage grouse story and conservation. We've always looked at oil and gas disturbances as a bad thing. Do you think you could scale your efforts up and start tracking reclamation efforts? So I wound up basically taking a year and a half off, where I was technically still a graduate student, but I wasn't taking classes. I was driving around the state and meeting reclamation specialists. I wound up getting 26 oil and gas operators to participate in a larger database. And I think in late 2014, early 2015, I entered somewhere around 70,000 acres of reclamation data associated with oil and gas into this conservation efforts database. And it was recognized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the national level for being a deciding factor in keeping the sage grouse from being listed. I was offered a PhD position, which was cool. It was funded by Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, Wyoming Game and Fish, several Petroleum Association of Wyoming companies, and then I believe the Audubon Society put in a little money into one of the grants I was on. And yeah, when I started my PhD program, I said to my advisor, I came to school to be an ecologist, not a database manager. So I want to go out and really study this stuff. So fortunately, through my contacts, through my master's, and then when I was doing my PhD, I got to study in the Wamsutter Field, the Powder River Basin, a little bit in the Lysite-Manita Divide area, a little bit in that kind of Rife's Rim area west of Wamsutter, and then I did a lot in the Jonah and the Pinedale Anticline. Jonah Energy actually gave the Wyoming Reclamation and Restoration Center a gift, and on it said, we don't want to bias any research. We'd like Mike to pick a couple questions that he'd like to study, and we don't want to necessarily be involved in the study design or know what he's doing or manipulate his data or anything. But all we ask is that it improves our reclamation practices or contributes to better understanding out there. So that's how I actually got to meet Paul, was I showed up to the Jonah field with a bunch of sweep nets and some Ziploc bags and some coolers. I said, I'm going to go see how insects are responding to different reclamation efforts. And yeah, through that, we got to help improve some of their weed management programs and work on some seed mixes and things like that. Yeah, my advisor was a soil scientist, so I got to do some soil work, and I had a really great experience in grad school being able to study a whole bunch of different things with several companies and a lot of different ecosystems across Wyoming.
Mike, it's amazing to me that the timing of not only your interest, your study, your pursuit of a higher education, but then what was going on, which was truly, I think, for lack of better terms, a crisis. When you think about the sagebrush sea and that fragile ecosystem that was across the West, from Arizona to Montana, California, Colorado, and of course, Wyoming in the heart of it, it was really disappearing. It was really prompting the discussion and the conversations around listing the greater sage grouse to the endangered species list. Have you ever just reflected on that, just the timing and the coincidence of just being in the right place at the right time, that, that just isn't coincidental? The stars aligned, right?
Yeah, they definitely did. I think a lot of it's hard work. I did a lot of research on where to go to grad school. I knew Wyoming had a lot of good reclamation and restoration type of work going on and whatever. But yeah, a lot of serendipity in there. I can't really always pinpoint or explain it, but it was interesting because right now I'm actually working with the Game and Fish on a grant where I have an intern, and what she's doing is looking at how insects are inside the sage grouse diet and going back to some research from the 1930s and 40s, 50s, and really up till 1994 or so, when they stopped being able to kill birds and dissect their gut. We've lost a lot of that information, so we're trying to compile all that. But yeah, when I was first doing that insect work, a lot of people thought it was because of pollinators, and that's a good story. But really, I want to see if we can recreate food webs for sage grouse, and it really looks like we can through reclamation. So it's weird that, yeah, I studied with the kind of the pioneer of that field when I was in Delaware, and I think it's really important now, not only still in Delaware, but yeah, that sage grouse isn't going to go away in the western states. So I'm happy to be a part of all that.
And I can tell you firsthand, just being in the conservation community, when that news and those efforts on the sage grouse started to take fold, it really was a crisis. You had state officials, private energy companies, our own Fish and Wildlife Service. I think everybody was scrambling to find a way to really get a handle on what this looked like in its current state, but then how do we reverse this decline without the federal government having to intervene and enlist this bird. And I'm glad to be able to have this conversation with you directly, because I know there are a lot of folks out there that maybe don't understand all of what went into this effort. But Wyoming, having a third of the world's surviving greater sage grouse, really was in the driver's seat, and everyone was looking at Wyoming like, how are you going to figure this out without big brother coming in and saying, this is how we're going to do it moving forward. And your work certainly contributed to that. And I'm glad to have you on to be able to talk about it. But when you talk about reclamation, what you've learned from that, how that was able to move forward, obviously the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gave great recognition to the efforts that were going on in Wyoming to keep the bird delisted. But you're talking specifically land interruption or disruption to the landscape and reclamation and where that plays for the entire ecosystem and that balance that it strikes. I don't think it's something that people tend to think about at the insect level or the level of an entomologist. I think they just think of, if we provide the right forbs and forage, wildlife can coexist with these type of disruptions. But you've taken it to another level, I think, for what most people just assume in their own mind in thinking about reclamation. But I guess essentially what I'm saying, or I'm asking you, is it really starts at a very minute level, and then everything works from there to be able to work in harmony. Is that fair?
It is. And I think what's interesting, at least to me, is back when I was working in Delaware and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Maryland, we get rain pretty consistently, and we have 200 days or more of frost-free, long growing seasons. We've got, if I were to go in my backyard in New Jersey right now, I could probably see black organic soil for at least 18 inches to 24 inches. I never thought about soils when I was working in Delaware because I just didn't have to really think about them. I get out to the Jonah field and you get 4 inches of precip, then you have 39 frost-free days, and you've got these really poorly developed soils. Yeah, back east, I always thought the insects are the building block to the terrestrial food web, and I guess really the plants that the insects eat. But out there, it's the soil, and the soil management is so important. And I think it starts there. And then once we can figure out that kind of stuff, what plants can we actually grow in this soil? And then what flowering species do sage grouse eat? What flowering species attract the insects that sage grouse eat? And the fact that the sage grouse is that umbrella species of the Western U.S., it's nice to be able to focus on that and say, if we're really, rather than just trying to do erosion control, we're being intentional and trying to grow habitat for that bird. I think it's a good step to probably help a lot of the songbirds out there and a lot of the other wildlife.
Yeah, Mike, how do you put it in an explanation where folks can really grasp the complexities of reclamation when you have so many different companies really adhering to their own methodology of how they implement such? Is there a way that you have helped streamline that? Is that something that the industry as a whole has really made leaps and bounds of progress in really identifying what works and what doesn't work and how to be accountable to it?
Yeah, and I think so. Earlier when you said Wyoming's been in the driver's seat for sage grouse conservation, and every other state in the Western U.S. and Canada has really been looking down to Wyoming. What are you guys going to do? One of the things I'm most excited about with what I get to do is reclamation and restoration. That's a different discipline than conservation, but there's so much overlap in it. And very cognizant of the fact that I have rubber on the soles of my shoes and I drive a vehicle and I need the fossil fuels. And there's a lot of tangible, great things that come with industry in Wyoming. I think a lot of the folks that work in industry in Wyoming are like the Paul Ehrlichs, who are outdoorsmen, hunters, fishers, and want to make sure that land goes back. If you look at the American Society of Reclamation Sciences dating back to 2002, the state of Wyoming has had 6 Reclamationist of the Year awards. I believe the University of Wyoming's produced 8 of the graduate top awards. So we've had about a third of the time Wyoming has the best reclamationist in the United States over the last 22 years. I think it's a credit to the people in Wyoming and industries trying to get ahead and saying, we've got to do good at this. The Petroleum Association of Wyoming just in December hosted their 15th annual Wildlife and Reclamation Conference, which I believe is more than any other state. As far as I know, actually, North Dakota might be the only other state that has something similar. But it was cool back in 2011 when the first one I ever went to, people were talking about, how do we do this? What is it like farming? Is it, when do we put our seeds in the ground? What, this, that, and the other thing. And then, Josh Sorensen, who's Jonah's reclamation specialist, and I just have a paper that was accepted 2 weeks ago about the age of soil stockpile. So we've been, the industry wide has been working on this for a decade and a half. And I think there's people all around the state that do it day in and day out for a living, who are coming up with new ideas and starting to catalog what works and what doesn't work. And aside from that conference where we share stuff, it's, I think, a pretty small community where, I think everybody's learning from each other. So I think I can safely say Wyoming is going to be, in a year or two from now, all the other states are going to start looking at Wyoming and saying, how are you guys doing that reclamation and restoration stuff? We followed your lead on conservation for the last 15, 20 years now. How do we get our mines and our well paths and our pipelines back? Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think you did, Mike. I appreciate that. I think another just maybe common known, method within reclamation is that oil and gas companies or the industry are required to reseed disturbed areas using native plants. We've all heard, I think, how important the pollinators are. I think that famous quote that is, with the decline of the bee over the last few years, it seems like people are more aware that this ecosystem and how it is truly a web is so tightly tied together. Just having something as simple as saying you got to use native plants, where can someone go to look for not only how that applies within the oil and gas industry, but how that just applies across the landscape for other practices and other uses as well? Private land ownership in Wyoming makes up about half the state. Right now, there is a huge conversation and a lot of money being allocated to really combat cheatgrass across the landscape. What are some of the sources of where people can go to find this information, knowing that there's just a lot more to it than just the lip service that is just making headlines?
Yes, the USDA has a lot of good information about not only about soils, but about recent research. The Bureau of Land Management has a whole Seeds of Success program. I try to keep a lot of the literature I publish on my website freely available, and push that as much as I can.
What is that website, Mike?
It's abnovaecology.com, ABNOVA, ecology.
Okay.
But yeah, if you go on the publications page there, a lot of my stuff I try to make freely accessible. And then one of the things I'm actually super excited about, I just last week got full go with another game and fish project where I'll be interviewing and conducting surveys with the reclamation practitioners from different industries across the state. And I'm actively working with Game and Fish and the Wyoming Mining Association and Petroleum Association of Wyoming and the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust to figure out the best platform. But my hope is that when we get this kind of up and running, that some of that information will be easily accessible, that if somebody's dealing with a clay soil in an 11 to 14 inch precip zone, they can go on and see what's the best way to handle their soils and what seed mixes work and don't work. So I think there's going to be a lot of really cool stuff that comes out of that. And we're actively working to figure out how to make sure that's easily disseminable, or we can disseminate the research easy. And then, University of Wyoming has, if you go on the Wyoming Reclamation and Restoration Center's site at UW, there's a lot of technical bulletins. The Wyoming Natural Diversity Database has a bunch of information about, you can, for example, type in a plant name and it will show you on an interactive map where that grows and whatnot. So there's plenty of resources out there.
Mike, when you look at seed mixes, soil amendments, herbicide applications, fertilizers, just soil disruption as a whole, what's the takeaway in what's really been learned, and how does that vary specific to a state like Wyoming that has had years, almost 3 decades worth of drought, and then they come out of those drought periods? How has those changes been implemented at like the seed mix level? Are those always evolving, or has there become a standard that is just accepted to be what works, and that's come through years of study and data to be able to mine that information?
I think that's growing actually pretty rapidly. My take on it is I believe most Bureau of Land Management field offices can provide people with recommended seed mixes. What I'm really finding, and part of this survey method, last year I got 8 white papers from, I think 3 came from the oil and gas industry, 4 came from the Wyoming mining industry, and then 1 came from the Department of Transportation, someone that was working on kind of roadside construction and reclamation. But all of them talk about the importance of soil handling. And when you're segregating your soil, making sure you're mapping it out first. And we have really fine kind of soil horizons in Wyoming, making sure that you're keeping the salts and the calcium out of your topsoil mix and segregating the suitable growth material from the salty stuff and kind of the overburden. And I think that's really the key, is a little extra effort up front saves a whole lot of effort down the line if you fail at that. Yeah, it's careful mapping and looking at pre-existing vegetation surveys and stuff like that. But that seems to be, I think, really critical. I think probably 15 years ago, it was recommended just strip 6 inches and that's good. Now, I think operators are learning in some areas we might be able to get 8 or 10 inches, and in other areas we might be able to get 2 or 3 inches, but it is worth the time and effort to figure that out and make sure we're not reintroducing our salts and non-suitable materials back at the surface when we respread our soils. That's one thing to go about it. We've had a lot of success in both the Jonah and the Pinedale anticline using Rocky Mountain bee plant. It's this native annual flowering species that'll grow, I don't know, anywhere from 3 to 6 feet tall. It grows in disturbed soils and it puts down this carrot-like taproot. It seems to be able to retain moisture. It keeps a lot of our weeds at bay, and it seems to do a nice job setting the stage for our perennial flowering species, our grasses and our sagebrush and the like. So that's been one thing I think that's really advanced. And then, yeah, it's one of the things I love is I got lucky in my experience in academia. I got to work with a lot of practitioners, a lot of folks. That's not a knock on anybody, just some ways research projects works is you get funding to do a greenhouse study. I got to spend a lot of windshield time with these folks, and this past summer, I got to spend some time up in Pinedale with Pure West and their reclamation specialist, Jasmine Allison, and I spent a couple days driving around, and it's cool just listening to someone like that think, and she'll point out the window and say, in the last 12 years, we've changed the seed mix in this zone 5 different times because I'm looking at my monitoring data, and these species don't seem to ever come out, so we don't use them anymore, and we always get this western wheatgrass grows all the time over here. That's been cool when you get consistency with talented people in those positions who can keep their own field notes and really learn that even as stuff like seed timing is something all these people talk about. Is we seed our sites in June or July, the seeds are gonna desiccate and dry out. So let's wait and seed very late fall, try to trap that winter moisture and give these things the head start. So I think, yeah, it's rapidly evolving, but I think we're really getting there.
Yeah, I find it to be very fascinating. I think it's very thought-provoking, but I still go back to the idea in our original conversation that when you talk about this at the level of an insect and how critical of a component that is to the terrestrial ecosystem, truly that is, by many accounts, considered the ecosystem engineer. When you talk about a healthy habitat, I think sometimes that goes without saying that I think it's mind-boggling. When you talk about the number of different individual insects that are out there and that are utilizing these ecosystems, do you have a count on that? Is it that detailed to where you're really trying to identify the varying type of insects? And I know that can be a little bit nerdy, but really that's what it takes, doesn't it?
It does. And as I'm actually sitting on my computer, I'm going to pull that data up. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head that insects are ecosystem engineers, and they're famous for being pollinators, but they're also, they do a lot of work decompacting soil and cycling nutrients. Like I said earlier, that 96% of terrestrial birds, it's their primary source of food. It's pretty remarkable. One of the things that's cool studying them with restoration is, out of all the animals on planet Earth, not only are they the most diverse, but they respond the most rapidly to environmental change. So I know one of my studies in the Pinedale, we had 22 times more insects on our reclaim pads than we would have seen in the reference areas. One of the things, just off the top of my head, I know it's like after ants, these leaf beetles seem to be the number 2 source of protein for sage grouse chicks. Down in the Jonah, they're from the chrysomylid family. We had 77 times more of them when we were using that Rocky Mountain bee plant, which I think is...
Mike, is the Rocky Mountain bee plant you're referencing, is that the plant that kind of has a lavender flower to it, light purple?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, light
I'm
purple.
familiar with that.
Yes, let me see here. On our reclaimed sites in the Pinedale anticline natural gas field, a study I conducted last summer, we have 233 unique species of insects. And then on our reference area, we have 121 unique species. So we almost have double the amount of diversity at the species level in our reclamation areas. And those were on sites that are 5 to 12 years old. So I think that's an encouraging thing.
Yeah. So when you talk about showing up to the Jonah with a cooler, a net, and Ziploc bags, literally you're collecting each individual different insect that you found?
Yeah. So what I would do is I randomly select my well pads, or last year I wanted to study. It's pretty kind of common. I always look at reclamation assisted succession. When you think of successional models, if you go back to grade school, when you see that linear progression from bare ground to you have a little bit of grasses and a little bit of flowers all the way out to a dense forest system. In our zone, our forest is the sagebrush. But what we think in ecology is that as we move across that successional pathway, there's usually an exponential growth of biodiversity in that early stage. And then when we hit that peak, things taper off. With my previous research from the Jonah and the Pinedale, looking at really early sites, we'd see anywhere from 12 to 22 times more insects on our reclaim. What I wanted to do last summer is see if I could figure out where we taper off. So I started looking at sites that were 12 years old, and still at age 12, we're seeing 4 times as many insects on our reclaim compared to our reference. So we haven't totally tapered off yet. But what I'm doing is going out and randomly selecting pads that are 12 years old that were seeded with the same mix, and I'll walk 2 50-meter transects and I'll sweep a canvas bag. It almost looks like a fishing net, but it's canvas, and I'll sweep every meter across a 50-meter transect, dump all that out into a Ziploc bag, freeze it, and then under the microscope, that everything gets down to the species level. I try not to really look at what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing in the field, but I try to wait till I get to the microscope level to really try to understand what exactly is going on. And I start linking it to what plants are out there and things like that. So it's neat. There's a lot of cool questions. Other things that I find, like these sarcophagid flies, they're the flesh-eating flies. The only thing we know about them is from forensic entomology, where we know that their larvae grow in the sarcophaguses of warm-blooded mammals. So it's like I find them. My next question is probably at the adult stage. They're on these well pads because we have more flowers there. But my guess is that there's probably a dead rodent or a dead antelope or something like that pretty close by. So there's a lot of questions that I think can stem from some of this initial research. But yeah, that's how I do it.
I find it, to me, it's mind-blowing when you think about being able to have that type of detailed count and being able to take a host of different myriapods of centipedes and millipedes and then break down the individuality with them, or even the arachnids with spiders and mites and scorpions, and just know that you're looking for the uniqueness of each individual difference. That takes a special person to do that work, man. I'm glad you do it.
Yeah, I send the insects to a lab state. They have a couple guys that stay behind the microscope, and then I interpret the data. But no, I think it's important stuff. And then I think you talk about the Endangered Species Act, and that seems to be a pretty powerful environmental act. And more you're starting to see the Western bumblebee on that list, or as a species of concern, and so on and so forth. So I'm hoping that some of these data sets become more useful than just showing that we have good biodiversity and that we have highly functioning ecosystems. That someday I could see that being a story of reclamation is going to be the answer to bring some of those species back or bump their numbers up if we can figure out what flowers are attracting certain species.
Yeah, that's fascinating. No, Mike, I appreciate the opportunity to really take this from a 30,000-foot view and break this down to the soil level, because I know there are a lot of moving parts here, and it does take a very specialized focus and education, and just the garnered interest that you have in this field it's really amazing, actually. But I think the other part to that just when you talk about reclamation and oil and gas and that disturbance on the landscape and the industry standards of reclamation, how they're continuing to evolve and continue to change, where do you see it in 5-10 years from now? Where is there room for growth and progress within that? And is that always going to be something that you never hit the benchmark, but it will always continue to evolve because we always continue to learn and get better? Is that the takeaway?
One of the things that somebody called restoration ecology back, I think, in the early 2000s, like the acid test for ecology. It's like where we can learn so much about competition. We can learn a lot about like niche partitioning and study a lot of these kind of ecological theories. So I think it'll always be evolving. One thing I think we're learning across the board is that seed source seems to matter. So I was doing a study with a buddy of mine down outside of Laramie in the Rocky Mountain Cement, these limestone quarries with mountain mahogany. And there we're really finding that local mountain mahogany seed does a lot better than outsourced mountain mahogany seed. If we get mountain mahogany from Texas, it just doesn't seem to grow up at 7,200 feet in these kind of harsh, cold winter conditions. So I'm excited about that aspect, that the BLM and the USDA and the Forest Service all have these different seed programs that I'm hoping in 5 years from now, it's not, let's just buy the Reclamation 101 mix, that between the stuff that the industry is learning and the stuff that agencies and universities are studying, that we can really be targeting and be very specific of, if we want to grow, this is where we've got to source our seeds from and things like that. I think we're really just scratching the surface on some of the soil handling. One of the things that's interesting in this field is there's a lot of salesmen. So you've got companies that sell soil amendment, and then some of these white papers I get in from people who've been doing it every day for 30 years. We don't really need this amendment if we just handle the soil right the first time. So I think that there's going to be a lot of hopefully learning and listening to the people who've done it every day, how they're doing it. And I think synthesizing some of that information will be a really good thing. One of the things that I guess I'd like to just talk about real quick is one of my biggest fascinations in the field of restoration ecology is we have these benchmarks and choosing reference systems. You go to an area like the Jonah or the Pinedale Anticline, and our reference system is a sea of 150-year-old sagebrush with pretty little understory. It's a system that's been grazed since the 1870s. We had 150 years of land management there before oil and gas ever put the first well in or whatever. I always wonder if that's the best reference. And sometimes you'll see other management practices, rotational grazing, or people will use burning to try to thin sagebrush out in hopes that you'll get these early successional flowers and grass species back, or mowing or herbicide. The cool thing with industry is we can be intentional about it. When you're just burning a strip of land and hoping that there's an existing seed bank, there's a lot of hope that goes into that. When we make a pipeline or a well pad, as we've learned so much in the last 15 years, and we continue to learn, we actually have the ability to intentionally put the seeds we want into the ground. And I think as we continue to monitor that, it'll be cool to see how that plays out, because I don't think the answer for functioning ecosystems is always 150-year-old woody decadent stands of sagebrush. I think I always say, if in 30 years from now the Jonah field is plugged and abandoned and the Pinedale Anticline is most of it's in reclamation and not producing anymore, probably the healthiest ecosystem in all of Sublette County is going to be the skeleton of the old well pad and pipeline infrastructures, because the operators have been so responsible up there. So I think just continuing to see how this plays out long term. And one of the cool things I started seeing in the Jonah is you walk out into the reference system and all of a sudden you're seeing more flowers than you used to see out there. And I swear it's coming from well pads that these birds are going on there, eating seeds and then dropping them off, defecating them out half a mile away, and they're growing in the reference community. So I think that's going to be all cool stuff to look at, of how our intentional goals to improve our well pads and our pipelines actually have expanding consequences out into the reference areas.
Yeah, that's profound, Mike. And I think I'm so glad you touched on that. I think if there is something that I have noticed over the last decade and a half, particularly with the oil and gas industry, is that they're probably the worst at tooting their own horn for the work that they do. The byproducts of what they're adhering to in their role of providing a healthy landscape with the disturbance that their industry has, it's just not talked about enough. And probably some of that is that it takes a very special person with a very specialized interest in education to be able to have these conversations, to really, no pun intended, but to plant the seed for the thought-provoking measures that are taking place to be able to have this type of impact and it be monitored as a success for a bigger picture of the entire ecosystem. And when you talk about ecosystem science and management, that's... Boy, it's like being at the molecular level. It's so detailed, and I'm glad that there are... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just appreciate you having me on, because I feel as though the best things I think I did in grad school, the first time I ever really went out to the field and got away from the data management aspect, was up in Pinedale. At the time, this guy, Pete Guernsey, was working for QEP. And I just went up there, I think, to grab a hard drive from him or something like that. And then I just said, could I spend a couple days? I'd like to see what the data I'm managing actually looks like on the ground. And I asked him if I could drive around with him in his truck for a day and a half before I explored it myself. And about halfway through the first day, he's like, why are you doing this? I'm like, I don't really know what a reclamation specialist does. I get all this data. I try to make sense of it, but I don't want to be an armchair quarterback in Laramie at the university. And just seeing one thing I'll never forget, there were these guys flagging a road out to where they were going to drill. And he pulls his truck over and gets out and starts yelling at these guys. And, hey, if you just move that flag 5 feet over, my job's going to be 20 times easier. And then you'll leave this big stand of sagebrush right intact. And I started thinking about it. I'm like, that guy was like an incredible steward of the land. Just a lot of these reclamation specialists in oil and gas are. And I'm just a kid from New Jersey. I got to see that firsthand. And then I started getting to work with other people. I don't think I'll talk to my friends out in New Jersey, or I'll talk to some of my friends in Laramie or in wherever I'm at that aren't in the oil and gas industry. And people say, man, we just always thought that oil and gas is just fossil fuels and it's bad. I'm like, no, they have like pretty highly educated and highly intelligent people making these decisions and learning and growing. And I think it's a story a lot of people don't know about. So I'm lucky I've gotten to be part of it. And I'm just glad for podcasts like this and other sources that had to actually have a platform to tell that story.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. I think some folks might just want to try to connect the dots. How does this really apply to when you talk about mule deer specifically as a mule deer conservation organization? But we picked the name Wild Things and Wild Places for a reason, because it's such a big thing when you talk about what has to be working for mule deer to not only be sustainable, but to be able to thrive. And I don't think it's not been documented well enough, but we have an imperiled sagebrush ecosystem, and there's a lot that is needed to be able to bring that back. And efforts that are coming from the oil and gas industry are certainly complementing those efforts. And I know that you've mentioned all the state and federal agencies, USDA, Forest Service, BLM, Game and Fish, but then even our own private land ownership within the West. I think we all have a stewardship responsibility to put our best foot forward. And I'm glad to have this conversation with you, because it just reinforces that those efforts are going on, and they're going on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I think it's cool just for me I'm learning a lot now that I'm in the consulting realm, that I don't have kind of that same blinders or hyper focus I had when I was finishing my PhD. But yeah, I know that those conversations go on all the time, where Game and Fish will go to an operator and say, hey, this new data just came out. We think you should maybe make some of your fences more wildlife friendly. And then that afternoon, I'll be talking to the client or whatever, and they're saying, yeah, we're going to spend $250,000 next year switching all our fences to wildlife friendly, or we're going to take some of them down, or we're going to limit our truck traffic, or we'll restrict vehicle traffic specifically from this date to this date, just so that these migratory animals can get through our field without being disturbed. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in it, but it's pretty wild to see most of the folks I've worked with in industry be willing to do that and go that extra mile. So that it's cool. You talk to some of them and they're like, we want our kids and our grandkids to be able to hunt mule deer and antelope out here. We don't want to leave a bad footprint. We want these herds to be better for our kids than they were for us. So there's that whole human element to it too, which is neat.
And the human element is just one of many parts that makes this work. I'm curious, Mike, just your thoughts in regards to sage grouse and the sagebrush ecosystem. It does seem that kind of the takeaway within those conversations is anywhere conditions are right for sage grouse to thrive, that there's a pretty good chance that the rest of the ecosystem will prosper as well. Is that fair?
I think, yeah, it's interesting because they'll call that sage grouse the umbrella species of the sagebrush steppe ecosystem. So basically, we save it and we'll cast this big umbrella and save everything else. So it probably is fair. I tend to think more that we handle our soils well and give our native vegetation the ability to thrive, that maybe it's really the sagebrush and the native flowers and the native grasses that we should be thinking about. But yeah, in a nutshell, I think if we protect that grouse and the flowers and the insects and the shrub cover that it needs, that we'll be doing a lot of good for a lot of other species out there.
It does seem that that's a good, and maybe that is too broad to have that as the umbrella indicator, but yeah, it does seem from a mule deer perspective, what's good for the bird is good for the herd, and many others, it seems. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. Yep. And then I think one thing that we'll learn a lot is, going back to that soil stuff, is I think we got to start also realizing what is not sage grouse habitat or what never was and maybe what won't be. So we're dealing with a bentonite mine and a greasewood flat. I don't think we've got to grow sagebrush everywhere or have sage grouse habitat everywhere, but we could probably in those scenarios figure out what native species will grow there and deal with it that way. But yeah, I think at least in the sagebrush specific systems, that I like that saying, what's good for the bird is good for the herd.
No, I appreciate the enlightenment of just being able to have this conversation with you. I think many probably think of insects as just a pest or an annoyance, but I think to be able to look at how they even have a role within this balanced ecosystem, it really brings this ecosystem picture of balance to something that is so minute and how everything has that interplay together. I really appreciate the insight. It's been fascinating. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much.
On that note, anything we didn't talk about that you wanted to make sure we got a little bit of discussion on, or any? It's impressive when you mentioned earlier the Society Awards, to know that a third of those awards have been given to Wyoming representatives. I think that's a testament that there's a concentrated effort in the state of Wyoming, and I'm biased as a Wyoming native and someone who still lives here and loves this landscape. But at the same time, I wear that as a badge of honor to hear that we have people within these fields that are being recognized at a national level and are really in the driver's seat, as I mentioned before, leading the way. And that's something to be proud of.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is. And I think, right now we're at this kind of pivotal stage. I think the United Nations declared 2021 to 2030 as the decade on ecosystem restoration, saying we've really got to figure out how to put our landscapes back. So it's certainly a feather in Wyoming's cap to be able to say we're probably the leader, not only in the Western states, but probably in the United States. I think after Wyoming, Pennsylvania had 3 awards in that same time span. Colorado had 3. I think one came from Australia, one came from the United Kingdom, and all the rest, every other state only had 1. I think it's a good feather in Wyoming's cap to say that we probably are the best at reclamation, not only in the Western states, but maybe in the whole United States. And I think it's going to be really neat in the next several years to just see how reclamation and restoration continue to be intertwined with conservation. And I think there's big things on the horizon. So I'm just fortunate to be a part of all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't have to look far to in any news source in the state of Wyoming. There's been a barrage of just rare earth mineral development on the horizon, uranium, everything under the sun. It just seems like is grabbing headlines right now about the wonderful natural resources that Wyoming is host to, and to know that these efforts are going to involve not only their operations to be able to extract, but then also their play in being able to have reclamation. I think this is a very important conversation. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but Dr. Curran, I appreciate your time very much and your knowledge and your insight to something that is very specialized, and it's been very thought-provoking, and I appreciate you, and I thank you for your efforts.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Absolutely. That invitation is open indefinitely, so thank you for that.
All right. Have a great day now.
All right, you too. Dr. Michael Curran. And if you are interested, as indicated with his website, we'll try to include that as a link when this podcast is produced so you can go there. This is a lot of detailed information. We just covered just a fraction of what the inner workings of this conversation entails. And I would encourage anybody and everybody to share this. And hopefully the takeaway for you listening to this is that it really just broadens how large this effort really is and how detailed it can really be. And I appreciate Dr. Michael Curran for taking this time to share that expertise that he has. This has been Wild Things and Wild Places. Stay tuned for the next one. If you like, please hit subscribe, share it with others. That's really kind of the challenge I have to you as a listener, whether this is in your wheelhouse or not. The amount of information and the variety of information that we're able to cover, it's an important aspect of what we do as a foundation. And this platform has been able to allow us to have more in-depth conversations on the many topics that are associated with the love of the landscape and the stewardship responsibilities that we have and the conservation efforts that continue. Wild Things and Wild Places, happy trails.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a muley fanatic.